In the early morning hours of April 28th in the year 1903, the earth under the town of Manzikert in what is now eastern Turkey began to shake violently. It was sudden, intense, and completely unexpected. A powerful earthquake struck the region, reaching a surface wave magnitude of 7.0. For the people living there, it must have felt like the end of the world. Manzikert, which today lies in Mus province, sits in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The ground beneath eastern Turkey is under constant pressure because it lies along the boundaries of major tectonic plates. The Arabian plate is pushing into the Eurasian plate from the south, while the Anatolian plate, which holds most of Turkey, is being squeezed and pushed westward. This collision zone has produced earthquakes for thousands of years and still does today. Back in 1903, there were no early warning systems. People had no way to prepare for what was coming. The shaking began without warning, and within minutes, homes, buildings, and entire neighborhoods had crumbled. The earthquake caused massive destruction across the region. 12,000 homes were completely destroyed. Not damaged, gone, flattened. For people living in rural villages with simple stone or mud brick homes, there was no protection when the earth turned violent. The shaking was so strong that the ground split in places, and landslides were triggered in nearby hills. Thousands of animals, over 20,000, died, many crushed in collapsed barns or caught in the chaos that followed. For a region that relied heavily on agriculture and livestock to survive, losing that many animals was not just a loss of life, it was a loss of livelihood. But the most heartbreaking toll was the human one. An estimated 3,500 people were killed in the disaster. Entire families were wiped out in an instant. Survivors were left digging through the ruins with their bare hands, searching for anyone who might still be alive. The sound of weeping and shouting filled the air in the hours after the shaking stopped. Nearby cities and towns like Erzurum and Bitlis felt the earthquake too. Though the damage there was less severe, buildings cracked and panic spread. Roads and trails used for travel became blocked by debris, making rescue efforts even harder. And because this was the early 20th century, there were no helicopters, no quick emergency teams. Help came slowly, by foot, by cart, or not at all. The people of Manzikert had no choice but to rely on each other. Neighbors helped neighbors, even while grieving their own losses. Makeshift shelters were set up, using whatever materials could be found. Fires were lit to keep warm at night, as many were forced to sleep outside in the cold. The strong aftershocks kept coming, making it impossible for people to feel safe indoors. This earthquake would go on to be remembered as one of the deadliest in Turkish history. But it was only the beginning of the hardship. The full impact of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would be felt for years to come. As the days passed after the earthquake struck Manzikert, the damage began to reveal itself even more clearly. Survivors who had crawled out from collapsed homes began walking through their villages, seeing entire streets reduced to rubble. Stone walls had collapsed inward, roofs had caved in, and the narrow dirt roads were blocked with debris. In many places, there was nothing left standing. The landscape looked as though it had been torn apart by war. Relief was slow to arrive. In the early 1900s, the region was isolated. With limited infrastructure, there were no paved highways or motor vehicles. The only ways to reach Manzikert were by foot, horseback, or donkey carts, and the trails were damaged or blocked by landslides. News of the earthquake spread slowly. Weeks went by before help from distant cities began to trickle in. In the meantime, the survivors had to rely entirely on local resources. Many had lost everything. Families were now homeless, living in temporary shelters made from wooden planks and canvas, or huddling in caves and open fields. With their livestock gone and food supplies buried under rubble, hunger and illness started to take hold. Clean water was scarce, and without proper sanitation, diseases quickly began to spread. It was no longer just an earthquake disaster, it was now a humanitarian crisis. The psychological toll on the survivors was heavy. Every aftershock brought fresh fear. People were afraid to sleep indoors, even in buildings that were still standing. Children cried at the sound of the ground rumbling, and adults kept one eye on the horizon, watching for dust clouds that signaled a new collapse or landslide. Entire communities were gripped by fear and uncertainty. Beyond Manzikert, the earthquake was felt across much of eastern Anatolia. In cities like Erzurum and Bitlis, the shaking caused damage to important structures. Mosques, markets, and schools showed signs of cracking, and some smaller buildings collapsed. Though the destruction was not as complete as in Manzikert, it served as a reminder of just how far-reaching the earthquake had been. Even regions not directly in the epicenter were affected economically and emotionally. In the countryside surrounding Manzikert, farmers were devastated. The land had shifted, irrigation systems were damaged or destroyed, fields were torn apart, and in some areas, the soil had been displaced so badly that planting crops was no longer possible. Entire growing seasons were lost. Combined with the deaths of 20,000 animals, it meant that famine was now a looming threat. The Ottoman authorities at the time did what they could, but the response was limited. There was no central disaster agency, no stockpile of supplies, no formal rescue teams. Aid depended heavily on local governors, religious leaders, and community volunteers. Donations were sent from neighboring provinces, and religious institutions helped organize relief, but resources were stretched thin. The disaster exposed the vulnerability of rural communities in eastern Turkey. Most homes had been built from sun-dried bricks or local stones, materials that stood no chance against a major quake. The collapse of these homes wasn't just a matter of strength. It was a sign of how unprepared the region was for a natural disaster of this size. In the weeks that followed, the people of Manzikert began the slow process of digging out what they could. Personal belongings were retrieved from the ruins, but for many, there was little to find. Entire family histories, photos, books, heirlooms had been buried or burned. Yet amid the loss, there were small moments of hope. People who had been presumed dead were found alive, buried under beams or inside pockets of collapsed rooms, rescued by neighbors who refused to give up searching. The memory of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would remain etched in the minds of the survivors for the rest of their lives. But this was only the early phase of a much longer journey. Recovery would take years, and the scars left by the earthquake, both physical and emotional, would run deep. Months after the earthquake, the people of Manzikert were still struggling to return to anything close to normal. The summer heat arrived, bringing with it new challenges. With so many buildings destroyed and clean water supplies either buried or contaminated, sanitation had become a serious problem. Flies gathered around waste and rotting animal carcasses that had not been properly buried. Sickness was spreading rapidly. Typhoid and dysentery were common. With limited medical knowledge and no modern hospitals nearby, even treatable illnesses became deadly. The destruction of homes and livestock had left thousands of people dependent on whatever help they could get. Food shortages were growing worse. Crops planted earlier in the spring had withered in fields that could no longer be properly irrigated. Entire harvests had failed. Families were now relying on donated grains, dried fruits, and whatever animals they had managed to save. The loss of 20,000 animals was not just a number. It meant fewer plows, no milk, no transportation, and no meat for entire communities. Despite the devastation, some rebuilding efforts had started. Using what materials they could find, wood, salvaged bricks, mud, people began putting up temporary homes. These makeshift shelters offered little protection against the weather, but they were a sign that the town was not giving up. Stonemasons and laborers came from neighboring villages to help, even though many of them had suffered losses themselves. In the absence of formal engineering knowledge, homes were rebuilt in much the same way they had been before, leaving them just as vulnerable to future quakes. Religious leaders played a big role during this time. Mosques that had survived the shaking became gathering places not only for worship, but for organizing food distribution and community decisions. Clerics gave sermons focused on strength and perseverance, and many people found comfort and faith when there was little else to hold onto. Beyond the town itself, the government had begun taking notes. The Ottoman Empire, still in its final decades, was under pressure from multiple sides, financially, politically, and militarily. Natural disasters like the Manzikert quake only added more stress. Officials sent reports back to Istanbul detailing the destruction, and engineers were dispatched to evaluate the damage. While resources were limited, the disaster helped push the discussion about earthquake risks into broader political conversations. Meanwhile, researchers of the time began paying closer attention to the geology of the region. Though modern seismology was still in its infancy, it was becoming clear that eastern Anatolia was resting on unstable ground. Scientists noted that the region was close to the junction between two major fault systems, the East Anatolian Fault and the North Anatolian Fault. These faults were now being studied more closely, and there were early theories forming about the movement of plates and how stress in the Earth's crust could build over time until it suddenly released in a violent quake. In addition to the main earthquake in April, there were multiple aftershocks over the following weeks and months. One of the more powerful ones struck on the 6th of August, causing new damage to buildings that had survived the initial quake. Some people who had started rebuilding saw their homes collapse again. A few were injured, and the fear that had briefly started to fade came roaring back. Many residents began questioning whether it was even safe to remain in the region. Despite the suffering, people found ways to survive. Communities worked together, sharing tools, food, and even space. Entire families moved in together under single roofs. Children played in the dust and rubble, finding moments of laughter amid the hardship. Weddings were still held, funerals still observed, and markets slowly reopened. Bit by bit, life was continuing, even if it looked completely different than before. For the people of Manzikert, the earthquake had not just destroyed buildings, it had changed the rhythm of their lives, shifted their priorities, and forced them to rethink how they would live in a land that could shake without warning. But they kept going, one day at a time, trying to rebuild not just their homes, but the future. In the years that followed the 1903 Manzikert earthquake, the tragedy stayed fresh in people's memories. Survivors carried the weight of what they had seen and lost. Family members buried under collapsed roofs, animals crushed in barns, entire neighborhoods wiped off the map. The ground beneath their feet had once felt solid, dependable. Now every tremor, every creak of a shifting house beam sparked a fear that was hard to forget. Across the region, this earthquake became one of the key moments that helped shift how people understood natural disasters. Before then, earthquakes were often seen as acts of fate or divine punishment, unpredictable and unavoidable. But the scale of the Manzikert disaster forced people to ask new questions. Could something like this happen again? Was it possible to prepare or even to prevent such destruction? At the time, formal earthquake science was still very limited, especially in eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire. There were no warning systems, no emergency response plans, and little public understanding of how earthquakes worked. But slowly that began to change. Scholars and engineers began paying more attention to the fault lines running through the Anatolian region. Reports were written, diagrams drawn, and early versions of risk maps were developed by experts in Istanbul and abroad. The Ottoman government, though strained and declining, did begin to gather more earthquake data. They compiled damage reports from towns like Manzikert, Erzurum, and Bitlis. These records would later help future researchers understand which parts of the country were most at risk. The memory of the 1903 disaster also started conversations about the need for safer buildings, though large-scale changes in construction would not fully come into place until decades later. Even without modern engineering, local builders and masons began to change their methods. In the years after the quake, new homes were often made shorter with thicker walls and stronger support beams. People experimented with new materials when they gained a when they could get them, hoping to avoid the same total collapse if another quake hit. Though these improvements were small, they marked the start of a long journey toward earthquake-resistant design. The disaster also left behind lessons in human resilience. Communities that had been torn apart slowly rebuilt themselves. Fields were planted again. Children born after the quake grew up hearing stories of survival and loss. Local traditions of sharing and mutual aid grew stronger. In some villages, neighbors formed informal watch groups that kept an eye out for signs of danger, shifting rocks, strange animal behavior, or unusual ground movement. Manzikert itself never forgot what happened. For decades, the earthquake remained part of its identity. Stories were passed down from elders to children, describing the moment the earth cracked open and the dust swallowed everything. The quake had reshaped more than just the land. It had changed the way people lived, worked, and thought about their future. Across Turkey, the Manzikert quake is now remembered as one of the earliest major disasters of the 20th century. It helped lay the groundwork for future efforts in earthquake preparedness, though progress would take many years. By the end of the 20th century, more than 100 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater had struck the country, killing more than 100,000 people and injuring many more. Each one added new urgency to the call for safety and preparedness. And today, Turkey has modern seismology centers, early warning systems, and strict building codes in many regions. These advances were not born overnight. They came from decades of hard lessons, of loss and recovery, and the 1903 Manzikert earthquake was one of the earliest and most painful lessons of all. The scars left behind by that earthquake are no longer visible in rubble, but they remain in the country's memory. They remind us of the quiet danger that lives beneath our feet and the strength that people can find when everything falls apart.